Apologies for the background noise, I live on a very busy road. The iPhone 5 is going to be 6 years old this year. But is it still any good? With an aging design and a tiny screen, let's find out. Hey guys, my name's Ryan Thomas with Failtech, and this is the iPhone 5 in 2018 and beyond. It's quite obvious by now that this one has been brutally battered. It has been through wars, it's been to hell and back. I played football with it in the earlier years of my teenage, and I mean I was playing football with it, I was kicking it about, I was throwing it at the floor, everything like that, and this thing is yet to have a cracked front screen, which I find absolutely crazy. Now, even when I bought it, it was used and has been in the 16GB flavour ever since it released from the factory, and based on that, you're getting a fairly small storage configuration whether you go for 16, 32 or 64GB. The build quality is absolutely stunning. This is one of my favourite eras of iPhone, the 5S and the SE being the pinnacle in my opinion. I really like the majority metal back with the glass windows on top and bottom, and then I really like the flat design. There aren't any protrusions and the edges are flat. There aren't any curves, there aren't any sweeping edges. It's just nice and minimalistic, and it looks good in my opinion. The buttons, even after all of these years, are very tactile, with the volume up and down being really nice, as well as the silent switch and then the lock button, all working really well without any kind of problems. Talking of problems with buttons though, the front button is a home button, and purely a home button, no Touch ID or fingerprint scanner here. However, also it tends to get clogged up fairly easily, and the tactile response has diminished over the years. It's one thing that I feel like a lot of the older iPhones have had problems with, and a lot of people who have replaced the screens have tried to replace the buttons as well and have failed. And there we go. The tiny chassis is one that fits in the hand really well, and I feel like the design has actually aged well going into 2018. It's one of the only phones on the market that you can easily one hand and one thumb, more importantly, which is something that a lot of people look for in a smartphone. It's very portable, and I say portable to the weirdest extent because a lot of mobile phones aren't necessarily very mobile these days, with them being so large, so this iPhone 5 is a nice chassis to hold. It fits in the pocket well, it doesn't have the protrusions like I said before, so getting it in and out without scraping is easy, and it's got a headphone jack, which is something not all iPhones have these days. The tiny battery that is part of obviously a tiny design is a 1440 mAh cell. Now it's really not that good, in fact it was never that good, and aging 6 years has not helped it in the slightest. There's no fast charging, wireless charging, anything like that, and the problem with such a small battery and an iPhone design like this is that it just doesn't last as long as you want it to, even when you're minimizing your use of the phone. Now I say with every used phone that you should go out and actually buy a new battery and replace it if you can. If you can't do it yourself, then it costs extra money, and at that point, why don't you just buy another phone? The battery life is anywhere from 1.5 to 2 hours of screen on time in my personal use, and my mum uses it to call and text basically exclusively, so there aren't any problems in her everyday usage. Of course, it only has to power a sub 720p display, which is definitely a big plus for the 1GB of RAM and Apple A6 dual-core chip. Mentioning that display for a second, as I said, it is a sub 720p affair. It's at 4 inches at the standard 16:9 form factor, and it's IPS. Now, a few things to take into consideration here. The first is that it's small, and in my opinion, it's a little bit too small. It's one phone that I don't think I'd be able to use because of my eyesight unless I really cranked up the text size. However, it means it's a lot easier to drive as it's a smaller array of pixels, and it's easier to power in terms of performance from that system on a chip. Thirdly, it's IPS, which makes for some really good viewing angles and also some accurate colors. It's not very bright outside, and it can shimmer, and apparently, according to my mum, the touchscreen isn't as responsive as it used to be. And I think to some extent these are all things to take into consideration based off its age, but at the same time, yes, it has been through a lot, so faults are kind of expected. I personally like the display. It's way sharp enough, it's clear, it's just not incredibly bright. The bottom firing speaker is better than most bottom firing speakers of phones of this era, so I wouldn't really worry about it. And of course it's bottom firing versus rear firing, so that's always an advantage. The dual core Apple A6 chip is one that's obviously not very powerful. It was kind of powerful at the time, but not cutting edge, not like the A11 Bionic is now. And coupled with 1GB of RAM, multitasking is basically a no-go. If you're someone who listens to music and texts, then maybe this is an option for you. But any of you who are constantly using games and recording games, because I believe you can record on your phone these days, and of course connecting to other hotspots, and then creating a hotspot for a friend maybe if you've got more data and stuff like this, and switching between them is gonna lag and potentially literally crash the phone. It has happened a few times for me, and it's something that I need you to be aware of, because when spending money on a phone, you kind of want it to do what you want it to do. A use for this phone that I think is perfect is an iPod, as long as you've got a good data plan, because of course the actual storage on the phone isn't a lot. But I really like this interpretation because Apple don't sell iPods anymore, or at least not routinely. And this is a good replacement for an iPod. It's got a decent-ish camera, it's got a better screen, and it works well with data services such as Spotify Premium, your Apple Music, and I believe Google Play Music as well. So there are plenty of other options that the iPod just generally doesn't do because it doesn't have a 4G interface. Now, I briefly mentioned the camera and said that it was good. It's an okay camera. It's not the worst in the world, and I think that's what's really important here but it's not amazing. It's like a camera that's kind of just there. It's like a placeholder. It's not a potato as long as you get it in good light. It's an 8 megapixel sensor with f2.4 glass, which isn't going to give you the best low light, and in fact it's not going to give you the best shots in decent light. However, it is going to do better than the majority of cameras with really high megapixel counts with this era of phone, because the pixels are just too small to make any kind of light any useful. I would recommend, if you're looking for a good camera though, even the 5S should be skipped and you should go to the SE if you want to keep this form factor. Of course, none of these phones have optical image stabilization, which is going to be a further problem in low light. And this one specifically, the iPhone 5, doesn't shoot any kind of slow motion or any kind of high resolution video. So you're stuck with 1080 30, 24, anything like that, but you're not going 1080 120 like you can on the 5S, and you're not going 4K like you can on the iPhone SE. The shots that I got from this camera weren't amazing, but let's just put it down to the fact that it's an okay camera. Now, when it comes to the front camera, I don't think I can sell this one. It's a 1.2 megapixel affair that takes dreadful photos. I mean, the selfies from this thing are just absolutely abominable, and the video's not much better at 720p. I'm sorry, but I just cannot sell the front camera. So looking at this from a broader point of view, I have to say that it's a contender. If you can get it for like £40 or less, it's really useful as a secondary phone, or even if you're just not a huge phone user, like my mum. She seems pretty content with the phone. The battery life seems fine, the screen's perfect apart from maybe that touch resistance, and the overall design works because she likes small phones. For those of you who use your phone a little bit more, however, in my opinion, the battery just isn't good enough, and the battery life therefore isn't good enough. The screen is okay. The lack of Touch ID or a fingerprint or even Face ID is something that deters me from buying this phone altogether, although some people have different thoughts about these things. The camera is passable, but again, the front camera is just completely unusable in my opinion. And overall, finishing off this review, even though it doesn't have an IP rating, and that wouldn't be introduced into the iPhone until the iPhone 7, the fact that this thing has survived this much damage, it's a well-built phone, put it that way. The iPhone 5S was known to have some issues, but the iPhone 5, in my opinion, just seems to be a bit of a tank. Anyway guys, that's pretty much it from me. So yes, I recommend it to you in terms of how useful it is, but I don't recommend it to you if you really want more power and more screen, although for this kind of money, were you really expecting much more than this? Of course, the software isn't the latest and greatest either, and won't be going into the future. You don't have any kind of software support here, and I believe hardware support is going to be more difficult going into the future. Anyway guys, I hope you learned something in this video. The iPhone 5 is a pretty cool phone, and it's one that I definitely call one of my favourites in my Apple past. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I want to thank my Patreons. You guys are awesome and you've helped me, and I love you. Thank you so much. Also, I recommend you go and follow me on Instagram because I've got some special behind the scenes on there, and other social media is cool as well. And I invite you to like, dislike, comment, and subscribe to never miss a video like this one. My name's been Ryan Thomas for Failtech. I hope you've enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.